All right. Okay. It's been a long time, boys and girls. Okay. It's been a long time, boys and girls. I'm glad to have everyone back. It's been a dreadful 2 months without my laptop, but thanks for having me back and thanks for joining the party. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I've got a brand new laptop. It doesn't make a sound. There's no god-awful fan. The screen works, the sound works. It's amazing. So it's been 2 months, so I'm a bit rusty. So I apologize if the classes are not as erudite and organized as they usually are. But yeah, we're going to take it away. It looks like it's going to be a fairly short class, only about 25 to 30 minutes. And yeah, we'll do a bit of a Q&A afterwards as well, I think. Why not? Okay, so away. Let me remember how to do this. Afrotherians. Away we go. In the beginning. There we go. Can everyone see? You can put your you can turn your marks on. There's only a few of us, so if you want to put your marks on, it's fine. Okay, so going from where we were last time, we started with Afrotherians, which are dussies and elephants, and we're doing one other group today, which are the dugongs and the manatees, the Sirens, Sirenia. Okay, so Afrotherians, just a bit of a recap. The Afrotherians originated on the isolated continent of Africa. If you went back 50 million years ago, well, earlier than that, from about 180 to about 50 million years ago, Africa was isolated. There were no animals getting on and no animals getting off, unless they were birds. And because of this, we had a lot of interesting evolution happening. So the Afrotherians were a diverse group of animals that dominated Africa during this time before they had access from the Antherians and the Euarchonglares, which are primates and rodents and all those guys. And we had a lot of evolutionary convergence. You know, I love that term. So genetically, Afrotherians share an ancestry with South American xenothrans, which, if you remember, are the weird-hipped or the weird-boned mammals from South America, and they're odd animals like sloths, armadillos, and ant bears. And we'll go more into detail with them in a couple of weeks when we get around to them. So remember, when we talk about Afrotherians, we're not talking about the giant elephants of today, the dugongs, the manatees, the aardvarks. Most mammals from about 100 million years ago were small and rodent-like. Why? Because they were dinosaurs and they were kicking everything's ass. So there was no ecological niche available for them to be anything except for small little rodent-like animals. And whether they were monotremes or marsupials or placentals, they were all ecological equivalents, which means they were small and rodent-like. Some of them were granivores, eating grains, and some of them were insectivores, eating insects. And that's pretty much all that mammals had going for them. Their great heyday of the Triassic period, when the therapsids ruled the world, that was their prime day. But then they collapsed to becoming this very small little group of, unassuming little rodent-like creatures. So they were small rodent-like mammals and occupied from about 100 million years ago to, well, until when rodents first started appearing on the scene. Only the last 65 million years after dinosaurs died out did rodents really, or any of these rodent-like creatures, and I say rodents, I'm not referring to the rodentia order, I'm just saying they're rodent-like. These rodent-like mammals really start evolving and finding niches that were previously occupied were now vacant, and they were able to start exploiting these opportunities. So from around 550 million years ago until 180 million years ago, Gondwanaland, which was the southern African the southern hemisphere continents, were all bound together. Australia, Antarctica, India, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, South America, they were all fused. About 180 million years ago, they started breaking up. Now, remember, this breakup didn't happen instant overnight. So you'd have literally a couple centimeters every single year. So about 180 million years ago, we saw them breaking up. So you're still quite able to get from South America to Africa and Antarctica, but there was fracturing happening, and gradually these continents separated. By about 50 million years ago, they were completely isolated, but it didn't happen. It's just not like in 180 million years ago, bang, the continents were isolated from each other. The fracturing started to occur from about 180 to 50 million years ago, and it was gradual. So you had time for animals to move backwards and forth. But eventually what you started getting were these ecological isolations. And this little bubble over here is to indicate that the Afrotherians, the Zetherians would have shared a common ancestry. And as these continents broke apart, some of them would have gradually become isolated in Africa, and some of them would have been gradually isolated in South America. And they would have broken apart into two separate superorders. They're known as Atlantogenata, literally forming out of the Atlantic. So the Xenotherians and the Afrotherians both came from Atlantogenata. We won't go into the laws of Therians today because we did them a while ago. Those were predators, your carnivores and your antelopes and all those other guys. So about 50 million years ago, we had two completely separated superorders of mammals. So we had the Xenotherians over here, and we had the Afrotherians in Africa. Africa still being very isolated. South America, if you remember those talks we did a while ago, had interconnecting islands coming and going depending on the rising of the ocean levels due to glaciation. But Africa was pretty isolated. You can see there's an overlay of the world map there telling where the world will be one day. But Europe was a bit of a mess. North America was more or less intact. South America and Africa, Australia were fairly intact, but Asia was a huge mess. Okay, so modern Afrotherians are broken into two clades. Now, clade is just a loose taxonomical order that we use to define animals and say they're related, but we're still working out exactly how they're related. So the one group which we haven't done yet are the Afro-Insectophila, which literally means African insect lovers. And those are your weird animals like art fox and golden moles and elephant shrews that eat insects. The pangulatas, which are the almost ungulates, and we covered elephants and dussies last time, and those are almost ungulates. They have hoof-like structures, but they're not fully ungulates. They look quite similar to ungulates though. So going forward a little bit, why do we notice that there's so much diversification with smaller animals and so few examples of large animals? And I've talked about this before, but people ask me again, why do we get so many different types of rodents and so few types of elephants, for example? And that's also all to do with habitat. When you are dealing with habitat, smaller habitats tend to become more niche. And if you're a smaller animal, you can occupy a smaller area, therefore more of a niche habitat. So you'll find that all these little habitats that form in your ecosystems, these are just the different colors that I've used, all start getting different rodents that are adapting to each of the specific environments, and then gradually speciation occurs. However, if you're a big ass animal, like an elephant or a whale, you overlap a large number of ecosystems. So you need to be more of a generalist. And it's the same thing for whales. It's the same thing for manatees and dugongs. For large predators, they tend to be more generalist. For the smaller predators, they tend to be more specialist. And that's often the case because the larger you are, the more of a blend your ecosystem is. When the smaller you are, your ecosystem is quite finite, very, very small. Okay, so going on to Hyraxes, Sirens, and elephants. Now, they share a lot of things in common beyond their genetic similarities, which is actually of all the mammals, they are the most conclusively relatable because we have hard evidence that cannot be denied. They can't be argued against. It's not even up for conjecture or sort of stipulation whether or not they're related. They are categorically related. Now, all three have toenails instead of claws. In fact, down here, these are the toenails of a manatee, and they look almost like an elephant's toenails. They don't have claws. All three have frontal mammary glands. When I say frontal, it means they have them between the front limbs rather than between the hind limbs. That's in no way related to primates. This happens to be coincidental, but they all have that in common. So dussies, elephants, and manatees all have them between their front limbs. Fun fact about the manatees, they're actually underneath the armpits. So you'll find the mammary glands underneath their armpits, which is kind of cool. All three have internal testicles. Elephants and sirens both are both polyphodonts, which means they continuously grow teeth throughout their life, like kangaroos and like crocodiles and like sharks. So polyphodonts, the difference with them is they continually, rather than their teeth growing out from the base, they continuously grow out like a conveyor belt from the back of the jaw, pushing the teeth forward and dropping out the front. So with crocodiles and kangaroos and sharks, they grow from underneath, being pushed out continuously. With elephants and sirens, they tend to grow from the back of the mouth and getting pushed out the front as they get replaced. As you know, with elephants, they replace their molars between 6 and 7 times in their lifetime. And elephants and sirens communicate in very similar ways. They vocalize in very similar ways. They both make the same sort of songs, and they have the same sort of nervous receptors that are capable of hearing the same songs. So pretty interesting. Now, Cyrene evolution is pretty well studied. It's not as conclusive as other animals because marine fossils are hard to find. But fortunately, they're big. So we balance it out by having fossils that are hard to find, but fossils that are big tend to be the best preserved. So we meet a middle ground in terms of our fossil records. And they separated from the hyracoids. Remember, hyracoids are Hyraxes, dasyes, and all their various relatives that are now extinct, about 50 million years ago. The first known sirene was Pesocyrene. He was actually a semi-aquatic animal. And early hyracoids experienced numerous aquatic adaptations. Remember, we went through them last time, showing the various types of elephants that were semi-aquatic and almost hippo-like animals that were semi-aquatic. Most species went extinct, but two groups have survived: the proboscideans, which are the modern-day elephants, and the sirens. Now, the first was Pesocyrene from 49 million years ago to 46 million years ago. He's got some of the best documented fossils. And he occupied the Tethys. And the Tethys was an area which is basically now the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean before Africa locked up with Asia. So it would have expanded through the Mediterranean right through to the Middle East, and that would have been the Tethys. And that's where we have a lot of our fossils occurring. And this is what he would have looked like, Pesocyrene. Now, by contrast, last time I showed you, this was 2 months ago, so I apologize if you don't remember, Afrotherian, which was an elephant ancestor, and he was related to Sirens. He was around much later, but he had been more terrestrial in his habitat and more adapted for almost hippo-like conditions rather than swamp-like and estuarine conditions. And he would have looked like this. So although the bone structures are actually quite similar, you can see that there is some difference between the two. And then, of course, that proboscidean snout forming on the Afrotherian as well. So this is the Tethys. As you can see, Europe over here, about 50 million years ago, there was a big fat gap of shallow waters between Europe and Africa, and that's where the ancestors of both the proboscideans, the elephants, as well as the sirens thrive. There was a high number of proboscidean fossils found in this area, indicating that they would have had semi-aquatic to aquatic lifestyles. So modern sirens are broken into two genera, two genuses: the Trichichus, or the Trichichus, depending how you pronounce this, and the dugongs. So Trichichus are manatees and dugongs are dugongs. And people say, well, what's the difference? There's actually quite a few things that are different between the two of them. And although they're known as sea cows, not Afrikaans sea koi, which is hippo, sea cows are not strictly herbivores. They are 95% herbivores, but they are known quite regularly to eat animal matter as well. So they eat predominantly seagrass, and yes, grass grows in the sea. They don't eat seaweed, they eat seagrass. It is a species of grass, or several species of grass, that are adapted to living in marine conditions. But they're also known to eat mollusks, fish, and other invertebrates from time to time, including polychaete worms. They've been observed on the very rare occasion eating soft corals. So they're not 100% herbivorous, but 95%. And here's what's a fun fact. They're extremely slow metabolisms. Only about 36% of what other mammals, comparative mammals, are. So they can survive on up to 7 months with little to no food. I mean, that's phenomenal. And likewise, they're covered in blubber as well as like most marine mammals. But their metabolism is extremely slow and extremely efficient. So the Trichichus or Trichichus are the manatees, and there are 3 species alive today. They're all limited to the Western Hemisphere. Remember, the Eastern and the Western Hemisphere. And all species are adapted to salt and freshwater conditions. So they can live in the sea and in rivers. And the manatees are larger than dugongs. In fact, the largest manatee is about 1.5 tons and over 3 meters long. And that's the Florida manatee, which is a subspecies of the North American manatee. Also, the West Indian manatee is another name for it. So Trichichus manatus is the largest. He is a rather big boy, and then you can see his toenails there, just like an elephant. He's very cute. And he occupies this long stretch of land all the way from historically from New York. I'm not from New York, from the Georgia and those areas over there, all the way through the Florida, through the Everglades, and these areas all throughout the south of Mexico, Panama, and right down to Brazil. There are some areas that they go inland, the estuaries, and into fresh water, but they're predominantly marine. But they do, because that's simply because of their size. There are not many rivers they can enter. The next group is the Amazonian manatee. Excuse the spelling error over there. That was my fault. And he's slightly smaller, quite a bit smaller actually, and more adapted to riverine conditions. And they're found almost exclusively inland, simply because they are competed by the West Indian manatee in marine conditions. And they're found right throughout the riverine areas of South America. The last group is the West African manatee, who's been quite aggressively persecuted for fat and for meals and for bone and all the other things, and they're critically endangered. And they're found throughout the whole of West Africa, or quite far inland actually. And this is their historical range, but unfortunately their numbers are down to a few hundred now, so they're not doing too well. By contrast, the dugongs are limited to the Eastern Hemisphere. There's only one species. They're only found in salt and sometimes in brackish conditions like bay waters. And they are more adapted to diving to deeper grass, diving deeper for seagrasses. In fact, they have extremely large lungs, lungs that almost the length of the entirety of their internal cavity, their lungs basically range all the way from their throat all the way down to their kidneys. So they're extremely large, and they're capable of holding their breath up for 15 minutes underwater just to browse on grass. This is them over here eating seagrass. So people say, well, what's the difference? Now, of course, before I go on what's the difference, the dugong is found throughout East Africa, Mozambique, throughout any sort of saltwater environment where there's warm tropical waters. The largest populations are in Australia. I think there's over 2,000 pairs in Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan. They used to thrive there. They've been hunted to extinction in Japan. Malaysian populations are down to 100 individuals. Parts of China used to have them historically. Taiwan used to have a population, again hunted to extinction. India, there was a population. Anywhere where there is warm tropical waters, the dugongs historically thrived. And their only threats, simply because of their size, are humans. They're a little bit too big for most shark species, and also large predatory sharks don't do well in warm waters. So great whites and bronze whaler sharks and white-tip sharks, they tend to be found in colder waters. Manatees tend to be found in warmer waters. They tend to be safe from all the big sharks. Likewise, killer whales and those sorts of guys, they don't go into warm water too often. So the differences between manatees and dugongs are quite apparent. Firstly, you can see that the manatees tend to have a more of a lumpy, almost hippo shape, whereas dugongs are, by comparison, we're not comparing to dolphins, but by comparison, more streamlined. Also, their fins are much shorter, their faces are much longer and actually scrape the underside of the ground, whereas manatees tend to have more of a snout-like face, where the actual face is pushing forward rather than down. What you'll also notice is the tail. So dugongs have a flipper-like tail, like a dolphin, almost identical to a dolphin. Remember, in no way related. While manatees have this broad paddle-like structure over here. Again, because that's simply because they're riverine-like adaptations, and they've never really felt the ecological pressures to survive in deeper waters, where they've never really been forced to evolve their flipper-like tail. They don't need to travel long distances. They don't need to work with speed. They certainly don't have to dive deep. So that flipper or that paddle just kind of gets them around like an otter's tail. I mean, it's like a beaver's tail. So dugongs also have tusks, just like elephants, although they're not very big and you don't see them unless they're fighting. In fact, usually the only evidence that they have tusks is the fact that the males tend to get covered in scars like hippos, and the males will bare their teeth at each other. They don't look very impressive, but if you've got a ton of weight coming at you, swimming at you, those little tusks can certainly do damage, and the males often get covered in scars fighting for females. And they form these big lek balls, so the males actually get into a big group and just tear each other to pieces, proving who's the biggest and the strongest. And all those guys are rather adorable. You know, he's actually quite a voracious little, well, not voracious, he's quite an aggressive little fighter. Manatees, by contrast, do not have tusks. And you can see again, with the dugong, his entire face points downwards. So his proboscidean, almost a proboscidean type structure, points towards the ground so he can feed on the ground, whereas the manatee tends to have their face facing forward. Okay, there's also a lot of similarities with elephants in terms of their skull structure, but that's more just physiological, and it's not very interesting. It's just basically that they've got skulls, and you can see their evolutionary relationship to other proboscideans. So over here, you can see a a dugong's face. You can see how his face actually points down towards the ground. It's because he's a bottom feeder. He typically feeds off seagrasses on the ground, especially has to dive down deep to get lower lying seagrass communities. Manatees, by the contrast, tend to have these snout-like faces pointing forward, and he can often browse off the surface, and they not only take seagrasses, they take lilies, water lilies, they'll take various plant material floating on the surface. They've taken leaves as floating in water. So they often feed off the surface, off the banks. So they don't only need to feed off the bottom. That's why their adaptations are quite different. Although they do look similar, you can see the difference. The face of the dugong is much larger. One animal I want to talk about, which is yet another human heartbreak, yay humans, is Stella's sea cow. Which went extinct in 1768. Now, bear in mind that a modern manatee is 3 meters long, okay, and weighs 1.5 tons. Stella's sea cow was 9 meters long, okay. That's how big they were. And they were hunted to extinction by Russian whalers. The last one was killed in 1768. Yes. So they're only found on the Commandeer Islands. And again, if you remember what I told you before about larger animals tending to grow in colder environments, simply because of the colder waters of the Commandeer Islands between Alaska and Siberia, they tend to have larger, comparatively larger sirens. Just like elephants, the elephants that were living in colder conditions, the woolly mammoths, tend to be much larger than the elephants living in hot environments. Comparative species tend to be larger in colder environments, and comparative species tend to be smaller in hotter environments. So don't compare an elephant to a fox. You compare an elephant to a woolly mammoth, and you compare a dugong to Stella's sea cow. So that is the tragedy of Stella's sea cow, the largest manatee, sorry, the largest dugong, because they were more related to dugongs, that ever existed. And that is the bones of one that have been dug up on the Bering Straits back in the mid-2000s. And these are not fossils, these are bones, because there were whaling stations on the Commandeer Islands during that time. Now we can see there's a lot of evolutionary convergence with whales, with seals, and with dugongs. Obviously, they're completely unrelated, but again, similar ecological pressures create the similar ecological results or evolutionary results with completely unrelated animals. They're all mammals, but that's it. I mean, it's like comparing a human and an armadillo. We're both mammals, but yet somehow ecological pressures have pushed them to be similar. So you can see a whale's structure over here and those vestigial floating hip bones over there. And again, with the manatee over here, those vestigial floating hip bones. Seals still have full function of their legs, but gradually you'll probably find over the next 5 or 10 million years, those leg bones will eventually evolve. You know, selective pressures will push for greater rudder-like function with their tails, and they'll become vestigial, just like they were with ancient sirens and ancient whales. Remember, ancient whales also had vestigial back legs. Now, seagrass communities are thriving grasslands comparable to prairies, veldt, or pampas, except they live in marine conditions, and they have got special adaptations to surviving in salt water. They pollinate instead of with wind, with currents of water, and they've got little flowers underwater, just like grasses do, little inflorescences. And they can grow moribund. If you remember what moribund is, when the grass starts to go dry and brown because it's actually not getting enough sunlight to all the leaves. So ecological roles of sirens include maintaining seagrass communities that actually keep the grass short and keep it healthy. They ensure that it doesn't go moribund, that the grass doesn't start to become brown because it's not getting enough sunlight at the base. And they also break up sea sand compaction. So a lot of that sea sand tends to become in very sedimentary areas or sedentary areas. It tends to become very compacted, and a lot of animals battle to burrow in it, and tend to struggle to live in it. But so the manatees and dugongs, by breaking up this compaction, actually allow other animals to burrow into this. And also, when they actually are feeding in these seagrass communities, they're breaking up that soil, and any animals that might be actually living in that soil currently are exposed to smaller predators. And you'll often see angelfish and small little wrasses and that sort of thing hanging out with dugongs and manatees, and basically just foraging in much the same way oxpeckers and drongos follow other large browsers. So they're also, when they die, as everything dies, they become food for scavengers and for predators. And these large fatty meals are very important to a lot of seabirds and to a lot of small scavengers that live in marine environments. And without these large blubberous animals, they also will end up struggling to find food. So one of those animals can be food for an entire population of scavengers and for predators for weeks on end. So mythology, where does the name Cyrene come from? Quite literally from the Sirens of Greek mythology. They've often been confused for mermaids, and they've kept that name because of scientifically all this time, which I think is quite beautiful. So whales, dolphins, and manatees have long been blamed as mermaids and as sirens. And remember, in the Odyssey, the sirens were luring sailors to their deaths on the rocky shores. And that's often because these guys could actually be found in very close to shallow waters, which are often the areas that sailors would get beached or end up getting wrecked on rocks. Christopher Columbus famously reported seeing a mermaid in 1493, although based on his description, it's clearly a manatee that he saw. He talked about it being rather ugly and described all the other features. At the time, they had no idea what it was. Later, they realized, oh, he was talking about a manatee, not a human, half fish. And sailors, when they were trying to catch them, would often follow them into shallow waters, and they would end up floundering on rocky shores or on shallow beaches. And again, the mythology of sirens tying into that. Anyway, so that's the story of manatees and dugongs. I hope you enjoyed. We can have a bit of a Q&A session now. You can put your microphones on, and I hope to hear from you. Hello. Stop sharing. You guys want to put microphone on? Yay, nay? Anybody? Questions? Yes. Hello. Nothing. That's embarrassing.
I'm so impressed. I've never heard of them, the manatees, so I have nothing to say.
Oh, well, there we go, something. And they are the closest relatives of elephants. So remember, in Africa, on African soil, the dusties are the closest relative, but that doesn't mean anything. That's 50 million years ago. But on land, but genetically, the dugongs and manatees are their closest relatives, and they're pretty awesome. What I still love about the fact with the manatees and the dugongs, especially the dugong, how actually he almost uses a trunk like an elephant to feed. It happens a bit of evolutionary convergence. Their ancestors would have not had trunks, but still kind of cool how the same sort of ecological pressures create the same sort of things. Yeah, anything else, guys? You can be questions about last time. We don't have to talk about the manatees and dugongs. We can discuss anything. Q&A
Thank
by
you very
nature.
much, Nick. Thank you very much for coming back and doing the course. I've been lucky to live 30 years in Florida, so I probably swam a dozen times with the manatees.
Oh, you lucky
which
girl.
they're very playful. Yeah, they're very playful. They also like to be scratched, I guess, because they have. Yeah, so they're playful. One thing that I always found interesting is that when we were living on the Gulf of Mexico, sometimes they will come and they request fresh water from the host. I don't know why that was. Do you know why?
Well, much like all marine mammals, they cannot drink salt water. They cannot process salt. Their kidneys process the salt, and they actually have they have reduced their water intake in order to take in less salt. So they have very efficient kidneys. However, the problem with that is that they can sometimes get dehydrated, especially in hot water environments. If it's very warm waters, they tend to get dehydrated. So they do need to drink fresh water. So they'll often venture into rivers to drink water, fresh water, to rehydrate, and then swim out to the sea again, because they're not getting enough water from the seawater they're drinking. So because salt dehydrates them, and they got to process that through their kidneys. It's just as simple as that.
yeah, I mean, they're very, very clever to come to the garden, near the garden, you know, I mean, we're on the waterfront and request water, you know exactly what they wanted. It was very interesting to see the ecological role of them, because I've been to some center in Florida that mentioned, you know, everything about manatees, but nobody ever mentioned that. So thank you very much for that.
That's the problem. People tend to just think about, oh, they're nice to save them, but not actually educating on, you got to know why we're saving them. I don't like the idea of everything as a role. I rather think of it the result of it being an ecosystem. I think that's the way we need to think of it. I just use the term role just to make it everyday talk. But yeah, the result of them being in the ecosystems, that seagrass communities are healthier. So you could say that's their role, for want of a better term. But yeah, anything else? Kirsten, Frank, Shane, anything else, guys? Michelle, Anton?
Yeah, Nick, so I might have missed it, but did you say the dugongs are actually an endangered species now?
Yeah,
are they protected?
they're all endangered, but to very extent. The dugongs are critically endangered. As I said, Malaysia's got less than 100. So
oh, wow.
There were, in 1940, they estimated there were 70,000 of them worldwide. I think they're now down to like worldwide about 5,000.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And did you say they occur on the east coast of Africa, of South Africa?
Yeah, you won't. They've been recorded as far as Cozy Bay before, but typically the very shallow. They don't like those turbulent waters. They cannot. They remember they're very inefficient swimmers compared to whales. So they tend to stay to very shallow, very calm waters. So that nice channel between Madagascar and Mozambique and going all the way up to Eritrea, Somalia, those lovely, calm, warm waters are their environment. It gets a little bit colder comparatively and a little bit turbulent once you come down to KZN. So they've been recorded in Cozy Bay, but very occasionally. I think it's more of a case of them being washed down than anything else.
I was just wondering if any
Sorry?
I was just wondering if any organizations here are actually doing anything to try to save their numbers, if there's any organization in South Africa that's doing something to try to save the numbers.
I think in Mozambique there must be, because there are when I say thriving, there are communities there that live there actively. So they probably are. It's just a non-factor in South Africa because we don't really get them. You know, it's like you know, koala conservation in South Africa. We don't really focus on it because we don't get them. You know, although they're on our doorstep. I mean, they're on our doorstep. We should have some interest in them. They're fascinating creatures, and people always seem to think they're related to whales. And I said, actually, they're not in any way. They are, you know, like not in any way related to whales. They just happen to be evolved. Oh, there we go. The
Endangered Wildlife Trust, yeah. Okay, yeah, it seemed to ring a bell. I just couldn't remember who it was. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah. So
okay, super. Thanks for that.
Yeah, so the class went well. It's 30 minutes longer than I thought. I'm very happy with that. I try to slow it down as well, not too much information. So I still have to upload some old classes. I'm battling to get stuff off my old computer. I've got about 4 classes I need to upload from my old computer. So as soon as I can get my hard drive recovered, I'll upload them. And then I'll put those on, and then I'll also put this class on, as I don't want to do it chronologically out of order. Otherwise, people will get this class and not have known anything else has happened towards it. So, yeah. Anything else, guys? Yeah. Otherwise, yeah, awesome. I'm glad you guys stuck around. I really appreciate it. You know, I don't do this for my health. I do it for people because they want to come.
I'm happy you are back.
Yeah, I didn't bounce on you guys. I said I would come back. I didn't ever have any intention of just not coming back. But yeah, it was just simply a matter of getting my computer working again. If you remember the sound on the other one with that fan, it was like a turbo diesel engine. It was like going nuts. And the poor thing was, he was 7 years old. You know, it was just his time. He passed on from the mortal coil. I was very attached to it. Yeah, anyway, cool. Yeah, I've got a phone call coming through. So guys, yeah, I'll give you a shout. We'll be doing class probably Friday or Saturday next week. I'll have to confirm. My schedule is a bit hectic, and I'll try to do a class every week, but if not, it'll be every second week because I'm involved in a very big fencing project at the moment, and it's taking up a lot of my time. So let me just confirm, but we're going to try for every week. Okay, so we're going to continue with the Afrotherians next week with the Afro-Insectophilas, the little guys. We'll do them next week. Cool.
Brilliant.
All right, guys.
Lovely.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Thank
Adios.
you.
Ciao.
Wiedersehen.
Okay, super duper.
Thanks, Nick.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Gracias.
Okay.
Bye-bye.